Settle into the present moment and let the edges of the day grow soft. There is no need to hurry, no need to solve anything. Tonight, we step gently away from modern time and allow ourselves to drift backward into a much slower rhythm of human life. Picture a small place in southeastern Anatolia, in what is now modern Turkey, around 9,000 years ago. This is long before writing, before cities, before anything we would later call civilization. The land is familiar, but quieter. Hills roll without fences. Paths are made by feet, not plans. Smoke rises not from industry, but from hearths that have been lit and relit by the same hands. What matters here is not innovation or power or progress. What matters is proximity. People choosing slowly and imperfectly to remain near one another, to wake beside the same faces, to remember the same small events, to let days accumulate rather than pass through. This story is not about the first civilization. It is about something smaller, more intimate, and perhaps more fragile. It is about the moment when humans began to stay, and from that simple decision, everything else quietly followed. From the decision to stay, everything begins, not suddenly, but gradually, like a long exhale. What we are looking at is not a dramatic turning point, but a gentle shift in behavior. Before pottery, before domesticated grain, before villages had names. People who had long known how to move began to experiment with remaining, not forever, perhaps not even intentionally, but long enough for familiarity to deepen. This was not yet a plan. It was closer to a feeling, a sense that returning to the same place carried advantages that were not strictly practical. The ground remembered footsteps. The walls, still temporary, began to hold warmth. Over time, the repetition of days created something new, shared expectation. If you return tomorrow, I will still be here. If you are here, I will arrange my day around you. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet thresholds in human history, you're welcome to subscribe and return again. These stories unfold slowly, and they are meant to be revisited, like places rather than arguments. To understand these early villages, it helps to let go of later ideas about organization or control. There is no evidence that people gathered to govern one another. There are no signs of authority imposed from above, no clear separation between leaders and followers. Instead, what appears is density. Bodies closer together for longer stretches of time. Lives overlapping not just in moments, but across seasons. The first permanence was not architectural, it was social. It lived in the expectation that others would witness your days, that small acts would be seen and remembered, that the rhythms of sleeping, eating, working, and resting would slowly synchronize. This kind of closeness creates stability, but it also introduces something new and unfamiliar: constant presence. In a mobile life, relationships can thin and thicken with movement. Tension can be walked away from. Silence can be carried across distance. But in a place where people remain, silence becomes shared. Tension lingers in the air. Familiarity deepens until it is no longer optional. This is not yet conflict, but it is the condition from which conflict could one day arise. Daily life in these early villages was simple, but not empty. Mornings repeated themselves. Fires needed tending. Food needed preparing. Children learned by watching the same gestures again and again. Elders did not just remember the past, they embodied it through habits that others absorbed without instruction. Knowledge moved through proximity, not explanation. What is striking is how much of this life left little physical trace. There are no grand monuments announcing permanence. Instead, the evidence suggests floors repaired many times, walls adjusted rather than replaced. living spaces reused by successive generations. This is memory made practical, not ceremonial but habitual. Staying together required negotiation, though likely not in words. Small accommodations, minor adjustments. The unspoken understanding that one person's routine affected another's rest. Over time, this created a form of social patience, not because people were gentler, but because departure was no longer the default response. It is tempting to frame this moment as progress, but that risks misunderstanding its nature. This was an experiment without guarantees. Permanence offered comfort, but it also removed escape. It created belonging, but it also intensified awareness of others. The village did not solve human complexity. It concentrated it, and as days turned into years, and years into remembered lifetimes, this closeness began to shape how people understood themselves, not as passing through a landscape, but as part of a shared place where memory accumulated quietly, waiting to be carried forward. That shared place, shaped by accumulating memory, did not announce itself as something new. It revealed itself slowly, through repetition. Each day returned with small variations, and those variations were noticed because they happened among the same people in the same space. What had once been a stopping point began to feel like a center. Permanence in this early sense did not mean immobility. People still moved. They still traveled outward to gather, to hunt, to tend distant places. But there was now a place that pulled them back, a hearth that waited, a cluster of shelters that held the marks of prior days. Returning was no longer a coincidence. It became expected. This expectation subtly altered how time was experienced. In a mobile life, time stretches forward, defined by routes and seasons. Here, time began to fold back on itself. Yesterday mattered because it happened here. Tomorrow mattered because it would also happen here. The ground beneath one's feet was no longer just surface. It was layered with prior mornings, prior conversations, prior silences. Living so close for so long required a new kind of attentiveness, not the vigilance of danger, but the awareness of others' rhythms, who woke early, who lingered by the fire, who preferred quiet, and who filled the space with motion. These patterns were learned not through instruction, but through constant exposure. Over time, they became predictable, and prediction itself became a form of comfort. Intimacy, in this setting, did not arrive as affection. It arrived as familiarity. Knowing how someone moved through the day, anticipating where tools would be placed, recognizing footsteps without looking up. This kind of knowing is gradual and unremarkable, yet it reshapes social life. People are no longer abstract members of a group. They are presences woven into daily routine. Children grew up within this closeness. They did not just learn skills, they absorbed moods. They learned when voices softened, when space was needed, when laughter was acceptable. Elders, meanwhile, carried continuity simply by remaining. Their presence linked earlier days to current ones, not through stories told aloud, but through habits that persisted. Food was shared not as ceremony, but as necessity. Work unfolded side by side. Rest happened within earshot of others. These conditions created a quiet form of mutual reliance, not dependence enforced by rules, but reliance grown from repetition. If someone failed to appear, it was noticed. Absence itself became meaningful. Yet this intimacy also introduced strain. The same closeness that fostered belonging left little room for withdrawal. Small irritations could not dissolve into distance. Differences in temperament, preference, or pace had to be carried, not escaped. This did not mean constant conflict, but it did mean ongoing adjustment. What is important is that there is no clear evidence that these adjustments were formalized. No signs of structured authority stepping in to manage daily life. Instead, the village seems to have relied on shared understanding, reinforced by memory. People remembered what had worked before. They recalled moments of disruption and quietly avoided repeating them. In this way, stability emerged not from control but from continuity, from doing things the way they had been done yesterday, unless there was a reason not to. Change, when it came, was incremental. A wall shifted slightly. A space widened. A routine adapted. Nothing needed to be declared. Ritual, if it existed here, was domestic and understated. It lived in repeated gestures, in how a fire was tended at night, in how sleeping spaces were arranged, in how the dead were kept close, not as symbols, but as part of the ongoing presence of the place. Memory did not require monuments. It required proximity. Over time, this way of living reshaped social identity. People were no longer defined primarily by movement or momentary alliance. They were known by association with a place and the others who remained there. Belonging was not abstract. It was experienced daily through shared inconvenience as much as shared comfort. And as this quiet stability settled in, the village became something more than shelter. It became a container for human closeness, an environment where intimacy, tension, patience, and memory were held together day after day, setting the conditions for challenges that had not yet fully revealed themselves. Those challenges, not yet fully revealed, begin to surface when we look more closely at how these early villages actually took shape on the ground. What remains to us is fragmentary, but it is enough to suggest a careful, almost hesitant process. Houses were not arranged according to a grand design. They clustered gradually, responding to need rather than instruction. Walls leaned close, spaces overlapped. Paths formed where people walked most often, not where they were planned. Archaeologically, this creates a pattern that feels intimate even now. Living spaces are small. Boundaries are porous. There is little separation between one household and the next. This was not privacy as we understand it. It was proximity accepted as normal. The village did not grow outward with clarity. It thickened. Imagine standing there in the early morning before the day has fully begun. Low structures pressed gently against one another, their surfaces worn smooth by hands and time. Smoke drifts upward from multiple hearths at once, mingling in the still air. People move quietly, already familiar with where others sleep, where tools rest, where the day will begin. This closeness shaped daily behavior in subtle ways. Activities that might once have been solitary became shared by default. Preparing food, repairing shelters, caring for children, these unfolded within view of others. Observation was constant, but not intrusive. Over time, being seen became ordinary. Self-awareness softened. Individual habits blended into collective rhythm. The physical structure of these villages reinforced this blending. Floors were repaired repeatedly rather than abandoned. Walls were rebuilt along the same lines, respecting earlier layouts. This suggests not only practicality, but attachment, a reluctance to erase what had come before. The village carried its own memory in layers of use. Importantly, there is little sign that these spaces were designed to manage people. There are no obvious markers of centralized authority, no clear divisions between communal and private space. Instead, the environment appears to have supported negotiation. Movement required awareness of others. Sound traveled easily. Presence was shared. This kind of environment likely encouraged a different social sensitivity. When others are always near, actions take on weight. Noise matters, Timing matters, small choices ripple outward. Over time, people may have learned restraint, not as a moral rule, but as a practical response to constant togetherness. Children growing up in such spaces would have known little separation between learning and living. They absorbed social cues by immersion. Elders remained visible, not set apart. Knowledge passed through demonstration, correction, repetition. The village itself became a teacher, shaping behavior through structure as much as through example. There is also evidence of repair and reuse that suggests continuity across generations. Spaces were not discarded when their original occupants died. They were adapted. This created a sense of lineage tied to place rather than to abstract ancestry. Memory lived in walls and floors, in familiar corners and worn thresholds, yet this same continuity carried tension. The past was not easily left behind. Mistakes lingered. Conflicts could not be erased by movement. Living in a place saturated with memory meant carrying those memories daily. This may have required emotional adaptation, learning to coexist not just with people, but with shared history. What emerges from this is not a picture of harmony, but of endurance. The village functioned because people stayed, adjusted, and stayed again. Stability was not the absence of strain, but the ability to absorb it without collapse. This is a quieter achievement than monument building, but perhaps a deeper one. As we move forward, the focus shifts from space to experience, from how villages were built to how they were lived, and how prolonged closeness began to reshape the inner lives of the people who chose, day after day, to remain together. That choice to remain together, absorbing strain rather than fleeing it, quietly reshaped how life was felt from the inside. What we can infer from the remains is not emotion itself, but the conditions in which emotion unfolded. When people live in prolonged closeness, inner experience is rarely private for long. Feelings surface through behavior. Mood becomes visible. Silence is noticed. In these early villages, daily life likely developed a slower emotional tempo. Not because life was easier, but because it was repetitive. Repetition can dull urgency. When tomorrow resembles today, reactions soften. There is time to adjust, to wait, to allow irritation or grief to settle rather than demand immediate resolution. Permanence stretches feeling across longer spans. Living among the same people also deepens the sense of being known. Actions accumulate into reputation. A single moment does not define a person, patterns do. This may have encouraged patience, not as virtue, but as necessity. To react too sharply would be remembered. To act generously would also linger. Memory became social currency, though likely unspoken. Domestic life was the center of this emotional world. The hearth, the sleeping area, the shared workspace, these were not just functional zones. They were the sites where trust was reinforced through proximity. Eating near one another, resting within reach of familiar sounds, waking to the same voices each day, all of this created a sense of continuity that extended beyond the individual. Care also took on new dimensions. Illness, injury, or exhaustion could no longer be managed alone or avoided through movement. The village required people to witness vulnerability. This may have strengthened bonds, but it also placed demands on patience and empathy. Care was not abstract. It happened in confined spaces over extended time. At the same time, there was little escape from difference, personality, temperament, preference. These could not be sorted into separate quarters. Instead, they were negotiated through habit. Over time, people may have learned when to step back, when to intervene, when to endure. These skills were not taught formally. They emerged through living. It is important not to romanticize this closeness. Prolonged intimacy can amplify frustration as easily as affection. The village likely held moments of tension that left no visible trace. Raised voices, withdrawn silence, unresolved disagreements carried quietly forward. But the structure of village life suggests that these moments were absorbed rather than allowed to fracture the group. One reason for this may be the absence of alternatives. Leaving meant more than relocation. It meant severing accumulated ties. Memory, support, familiarity, all were anchored in place. Staying, even when difficult, may have felt less costly than starting again elsewhere. In this way, permanence reinforced itself. The presence of the dead also shaped emotional continuity. The past was not distant. Those who had lived here before were not erased. Their absence was folded into daily life, perhaps marked subtly in how spaces were used or avoided. Grief did not end with departure. It settled into the village alongside the living. Through all of this, stability emerged not as an ideal, but as an outcome. The village did not promise harmony. It offered persistence, a way of living in which people learned slowly to carry one another across time. This was not civilization. It was something more fragile and more human. And as this emotional environment deepened, the village became more than a solution to survival. It became a setting in which human closeness was tested, reshaped, and quietly sustained, setting the stage for new interpretations of what it meant to live, not alone, but together. That quiet sustaining of togetherness did not depend on grand moments. It depended on ordinary days, continuing without interruption. What makes these early villages remarkable is not that they transformed human life overnight, but that they made continuity feel possible. The village became a place where nothing dramatic had to happen for life to feel complete. Daily routines formed the backbone of this stability. The same tasks returned again and again, not as burdens, but as anchors. Preparing food, tending fire, maintaining shelter, these actions structured time gently. They gave shape to the day without demanding attention. Through repetition, effort softened into habit. Work was rarely solitary. Even when tasks were divided, they unfolded within sight or sound of others. This created a quiet awareness of shared effort. No one labored in isolation for long. The presence of others did not need to be acknowledged explicitly. It was simply there, woven into the background of activity. This shared labor also balanced difference. Strength varied, skill varied, energy fluctuated. Over time, these variations likely evened out through mutual adjustment. Someone moved more slowly. Someone took on more. These shifts did not require explanation. They were noticed, remembered, and absorbed into the group's rhythm. Time itself began to feel layered, not segmented by events, but by seasons revisiting the same place. The same corner caught light in different months. The same hearth felt different in heat and cold. Memory accumulated not as story, but as sensation. People remembered by feeling their way through familiar spaces. This layering of experience may have encouraged restraint. When tomorrow will unfold in the same place, impulsive action loses urgency. There is time to wait, to reconsider, to let tension fade. The village rewarded patience simply by making time predictable. Yet patience did not erase strain. Closeness continued to generate friction. The difference now was endurance. People learned not to resolve everything, but to carry unresolved moments alongside daily life. This is a subtle skill, and one that does not leave material traces, but it may be one of the village's most significant social achievements. Care for children reinforced this endurance. Young lives unfolded entirely within the village. They did not remember arrival, they knew only presence. Their sense of safety likely came not from structure, but from familiarity, the same faces, the same gestures. Over time, this created a deep association between stability and closeness. Elders too embodied continuity. Their ongoing presence connected current routines to earlier ones. They did not need to instruct. Simply remaining was enough. Through them, the village remembered itself. What we see here is not an early system of rules, but a shared understanding shaped by time spent together. Behavior adjusted not because it was enforced, but because it was remembered. The village functioned as a collective memory, holding patterns that individuals absorbed without noticing. This kind of stability is quiet and easily overlooked. It does not announce itself in ruins or monuments. It survives only in layers of use and repair. But it represents something profound, a human willingness to stay with one another through repetition, inconvenience, and change. And as this willingness settled into daily life, it prepared the ground for deeper tensions and adaptations, ones that would emerge not from sudden disruption, but from the slow accumulation of closeness itself. Those deeper tensions did not arrive as crises. They emerged gradually as side effects of success. The village endured, and in enduring it asked more of the people within it. The longer life continued in one place, the more individual differences became impossible to ignore. Permanence magnified personality. In a mobile life, disagreement can dissolve into distance. Here, it could not. The same faces returned each morning. The same voices filled the space. Over time, small differences in habit or temperament may have grown heavier simply because they were constant. What might once have been tolerable for a short stay now required long-term accommodation. This likely produced a quiet tension, not explosive, but persistent. A tension managed through subtle strategies rather than confrontation. Avoidance became spatial rather than physical. Silence replaced departure. People learned where to stand, when to speak, when to wait. These adjustments shaped social life as much as cooperation did. The village, in this sense, trained emotional endurance. Not everyone needed to be close in the same way. Intimacy did not mean openness. It meant familiarity. Knowing someone well enough to predict their presence, not necessarily to share inner life. This distinction matters. It allowed closeness without requiring constant emotional exposure. Space played a role here. Though dwellings were close, people still found ways to create moments of separation. A task taken outside, time spent with tools, a pause near the fire after others slept. These were not escapes, but brief recalibrations within togetherness. Conflict, when it arose, was likely managed through memory. Past outcomes informed present behavior. If something had caused disruption before, it was avoided. If patience had preserved peace, it was practiced again. Over time, this created a kind of social knowledge that did not need articulation. The presence of children intensified these dynamics. Adults were constantly observed, not as authorities, but as examples. Behavior carried weight beyond the moment. This may have encouraged restraint, not out of principle, but out of awareness that actions echoed forward. At the same time, the village did not erase individuality. Differences persisted. People retained preferences, strengths, weaknesses. The village did not flatten these. It held them. Stability came not from sameness, but from tolerance grown through repetition. This tolerance was not guaranteed. It required ongoing effort. The village survived not because it eliminated tension, but because it absorbed it slowly enough to remain intact. This is an important distinction. Stability here is dynamic, not static. It is maintained through continuous adjustment. Over time, this way of living may have altered how people understood themselves. Identity became tied not just to skill or role, but to presence, to being someone who remained. Belonging was enacted daily, not declared. In this light, the village appears less as a solution and more as a practice of staying, of negotiating closeness without certainty, of allowing time to do work that rules could not. And as this practice continued across generations, it began to shape something more enduring than routine, a shared sense of continuity that extended beyond any one person, quietly linking past, present, and future within the same familiar space. That shared sense of continuity, extending beyond any one person, opened the village to new ways of understanding human connection. When people remain together long enough, relationships stop being defined only by interaction and begin to be shaped by time itself. Familiarity deepens into something quieter and less visible. Presence becomes assumed. In this phase of village life, intimacy no longer depended on constant engagement. People did not need to speak often to feel connected. The simple fact of being near one another day after day created a background sense of mutual awareness. Silence was no longer absence. It was part of the shared environment. This kind of intimacy can be difficult to imagine from a modern perspective, where closeness is often measured by communication or expression. Here, closeness was measured by duration, by how long lives overlapped in the same place, by how many ordinary moments were shared without comment. Picture standing in the village during a quiet afternoon. Some people are occupied with small tasks, others rest nearby. No one addresses the group, no signal is given. And yet, there is a sense of cohesion, held together by familiarity rather than intention. Nothing needs to be coordinated because everyone already knows where they belong. In such a setting, memory works differently. It is not stored in stories told aloud, but in expectations. You know where someone will be. You know how the evening will unfold. You know which places feel calm and which feel unsettled. This knowledge is rarely spoken, but it guides behavior continuously. Shared memory also softens individual loss. When someone dies, their absence is felt immediately, but their presence does not vanish. Habits remain. Spaces retain their shape. Others continue gestures learned in proximity to them. In this way, the village holds memory collectively, reducing the burden on any single person. This collective holding may explain why ritual remains understated. There is no need for formal separation between ordinary life and meaningful life. Meaning is already embedded in repetition, in the way days resemble one another, in the way people return to the same actions, the same spaces, the same companions. At the same time, this intimacy carries limits. Being known over time means being known in inconsistency as well as in strength. Moments of weakness are not forgotten easily. The village remembers not because it chooses to, but because memory accumulates naturally in place. Yet this remembering is not punitive. It is contextual. People are understood within patterns rather than moments. A single failure does not define a person. What matters is how behavior unfolds across time. This allows for imperfection without collapse. In this way, the village supports a gentle form of social resilience. It does not rely on ideals or rules. It relies on time, on the gradual alignment of lives through shared presence, on the understanding that tomorrow will offer another chance to adjust. This resilience is quiet and easily overlooked. It leaves little material evidence, but it may represent one of humanity's most subtle achievements, the ability to remain close without constant explanation, to live alongside difference without erasing it, and to allow time itself to become the primary stabilizing force. As we continue, the focus shifts again. from intimacy as experience to intimacy as inheritance, and how this way of living may have shaped human continuity far beyond the village itself. That inheritance of intimacy did not travel as instruction. It moved quietly, through imitation and expectation, from one generation to the next. Children born into the village did not learn closeness as an idea. They absorbed it as environment. Proximity was not something chosen. It was simply how the world was arranged. Growing up within sustained togetherness likely shaped how people understood relationships at a fundamental level. Others were not encountered occasionally or selectively. They were always present. This presence normalized cooperation, but it also normalized negotiation. From an early age, individuals learned that personal impulse existed within a field of other lives. This may have fostered a subtle awareness of limits, not imposed limits, but practical ones. You could act, but your action would be seen. You could withdraw, but not disappear. Over time, this awareness may have encouraged a form of self-regulation grounded in context rather than rule. What is striking is how little of this required explanation. The village taught through exposure, through the steady repetition of shared mornings and evenings, through watching how others adjusted their behavior over time. Learning was embedded in living. This does not mean that harmony was assumed or achieved. Differences persisted, frustrations accumulated, but the village provided a container large enough to hold them. Time smoothed sharp edges, memory contextualized conflict. The group endured not because it resolved tension, but because it learned to live with it. One possibility is that this way of living reshaped how people understood belonging. Belonging was not granted. It was enacted daily through presence. To belong was to remain, to continue showing up within the shared rhythm of life. This made belonging resilient, but also demanding. The village, then, can be read as a long social rehearsal, not for hierarchy or expansion, but for coexistence. It was a space where humans practiced being near one another for extended periods, learning what that required emotionally and behaviorally. This practice may have left traces far beyond the village itself. Even as people later formed larger groups or more complex arrangements, the memory of this intimacy may have persisted, not consciously, but as a baseline expectation of what living together could feel like. Yet it is important to remain cautious. We cannot know inner experience directly. What we can say is that the structure of village life created conditions where closeness was unavoidable, and where time, rather than authority, mediated social life. As we move forward, the lens widens. From the village as lived experience to the village as a thread in human continuity, one that connects deep past choices to much later ways of being together without ever becoming the center of the story. That thread of continuity does not lead neatly forward. It spreads outward, thinning and thickening as circumstances change. What matters here is not what followed historically, but what endured quietly within human behavior. The village, as an experience, did not disappear when people later lived differently. It remained as a reference point, carried in habits and expectations. One way to understand this is through the idea of environmental memory. When people live in a place long enough, the environment itself becomes a guide. Certain paths feel right, certain arrangements feel stable. Even when those people move elsewhere, they may recreate similar patterns without intending to. Proximity learned once can be repeated later, in new forms. This suggests that early villages were not just responses to local conditions. They were training grounds for a particular way of being human together. Not organized, not articulated, but practiced daily. The lesson was not how to govern, but how to endure shared time. As environments changed, this practice adapted. Closeness might become more selective, groups might grow larger or smaller, but the underlying familiarity with sustained presence likely persisted. Humans had learned that living together over time was possible, difficult but survivable. This endurance matters because it reframes human sociality. Instead of seeing early permanence as a step toward control or complexity, we can see it as an exploration of emotional capacity. How much closeness can be held? How long can difference be carried without rupture? These are not questions answered once. They are revisited repeatedly across human history. The village offered one answer, provisional and incomplete. It suggested that time itself could act as mediator, that repeated exposure softened extremes, that memory could stabilize behavior without formal enforcement. This is not an idealized outcome. It is a fragile one, dependent on patience and circumstance. Environmental stability played a role here as well. When surroundings are familiar, attention shifts inward. People notice one another more. Social awareness intensifies. This may have deepened the village's emotional density, reinforcing the need for adjustment and tolerance. At the same time, familiarity can breed fatigue. The same patterns that comfort can also constrain. Over time, the village may have felt both secure and limiting. This tension does not invalidate the experiment. It defines it. Permanence was never neutral. It carried emotional cost alongside benefit. What remains important is that this cost was borne collectively. No single person was responsible for maintaining stability. It emerged from shared investment in remaining, in choosing again and again not to leave. This collective choice does not need to be framed as conscious or deliberate. It may have been habitual, reinforced by familiarity and memory. But habit itself is powerful. It shapes expectation. It narrows possibility. It creates continuity. As we continue, the focus turns toward how this quiet inheritance of endurance may still echo in human life today, not as a model to return to, but as a deep pattern that continues to influence how humans experience closeness, stability, and shared time. That influence, still echoing faintly, is not easy to trace because it does not announce itself. It lives beneath structure and language, beneath systems and identities. It appears in how humans respond to prolonged closeness even now, in the comfort it can bring, and in the strain it inevitably introduces. One possibility is that the village shaped an enduring human tolerance for shared space, not unlimited tolerance and not without friction, but a learned capacity to remain present despite discomfort. This capacity may explain why humans continue to seek proximity even when it complicates life, why solitude, though valued, rarely becomes permanent, why shared living repeatedly reappears in different forms. The early village did not teach harmony, it taught familiarity, and familiarity has a particular texture. It allows people to anticipate rather than react, to interpret behavior through context rather than impulse. This does not eliminate misunderstanding, but it slows it. It creates room for reconsideration. This slowing may be one of the village's most enduring legacies. When people expect to see one another again tomorrow, today's conflict changes shape. Urgency softens, finality recedes. Time stretches forward, offering opportunities for adjustment. This temporal awareness may have become deeply embedded in human social instinct. At the same time, the village also introduced a new kind of vulnerability. To remain is to be seen repeatedly, to be known not just for intention, but for pattern. This exposure can feel stabilizing, but it can also feel confining. The desire for privacy, for withdrawal, may emerge precisely from this early experience of constant presence. In this way, the village can be read as the origin of a tension that persists, the pull between closeness and distance. Humans seem to oscillate between these poles, never fully satisfied by either. The village did not resolve this tension. It made it permanent. Environmental continuity reinforced this dynamic. Familiar places anchor identity. They remind people who they have been. This can be grounding, but it can also resist change. The village held memory in place, and with it, expectations. Change had to negotiate with what was already there. Yet it is important not to see this as stagnation. Change did occur. It simply unfolded slowly, absorbed into existing patterns. This kind of change is subtle. It does not disrupt continuity. It reshapes it from within. The village was capable of adaptation precisely because it did not demand reinvention. When people later lived differently, this underlying pattern may have traveled with them, not as blueprint, but as sensibility. A sense that living together requires time more than instruction, that stability emerges from repetition more than from design. This sensibility may still surface whenever humans choose to remain near one another without clear hierarchy or purpose. In households, in small communities, in shared spaces where rules are minimal and memory does most of the work. The village, then, does not belong only to the past. It lingers as a quiet reference, reminding us that before large structures and formal systems, humans tested something simpler and more demanding, the act of staying. As the narration moves toward its final reflection, attention turns inward, away from continuity across time and toward the quieter question of what this early experiment reveals about human nature itself, when stripped of ambition and reduced to daily presence. That quieter question does not ask what humans built, but how they felt being together over long stretches of time. When ambition is set aside, when growth and expansion are not the focus, what remains is the texture of daily presence. The village offers a rare glimpse into that texture. One possibility is that humans discovered early on that meaning does not require constant novelty. That depth can come from repetition, from waking in the same place, from recognizing the same faces across years. This challenges the idea that fulfillment depends on progress or accumulation. Instead, it suggests that continuity itself can be sustaining. In the village, identity may have been less about achievement and more about familiarity. To be known was not to be evaluated, but to be situated. A person was understood through patterns of presence rather than through moments of distinction. This kind of identity is quieter, but also more stable. Such stability does not eliminate uncertainty. Life remained vulnerable to illness, loss, and change. But uncertainty was shared. When difficulty arose, it unfolded within a network of familiar presence. This may have softened its impact, even as it deepened its emotional reach. The village also reveals something about human patience, not as a moral trait, but as a lived necessity. When people cannot easily leave, they must wait. They must allow time to pass. This waiting reshapes perception. It slows reaction. It creates space between impulse and response. Over long periods, this may have influenced emotional regulation. Feelings still arose, but they had somewhere to go. They could settle into routine. They could be carried alongside daily tasks. Expression was not the only option. Endurance was another. There is also a quiet humility embedded in this way of living. Without grand markers of success, without visible accumulation of power, life measured itself differently. Value was found in continuity, in the ability to remain, to contribute, to adjust. This does not mean life was simple or gentle. but it may have been comprehensible. The village offered a world small enough to be known, not fully controlled, but familiar. This familiarity can be calming. It can also be limiting. Both are true. What the village suggests, perhaps, is that humans are capable of living within narrow horizons without feeling diminished. That meaning can be drawn from depth rather than breadth, from shared memory rather than expansion. As the narration approaches its final movement, the village recedes from view, not as an origin point or a lesson, but as a quiet mirror. A reminder that before complexity, before ambition, humans explored closeness itself and found ways, however imperfect, to live within it. The final reflection turns not toward explanation, but toward stillness, allowing the image of those early, enduring lives to settle gently into the present moment. That stillness is where the village ultimately remains, not as a place we can return to, and not as a model to recover, but as a memory of possibility. A moment in deep time when humans learned, slowly and without certainty, how to stay near one another. What lingers is not a structure, but a feeling. The sense of days unfolding without urgency, of lives overlapping long enough to become familiar, of meaning emerging not from declaration, but from repetition. These are quiet achievements, easily overlooked, yet deeply human. The village did not resolve the challenges of closeness. It lived within them. It held tension without naming it. It carried difference without erasing it. In doing so, it revealed a capacity for endurance that did not depend on control or hierarchy, but on time and presence. Perhaps this is why the village feels so distant and so near at once. Its conditions no longer exist, yet its emotional landscape remains recognizable. The comfort of familiarity, the strain of constant presence, the subtle negotiation between self and others. These experiences continue to shape human life in countless forms. In remembering the village, we are not looking for origins or explanations. We are acknowledging an early chapter of human intimacy, one written not in monuments or texts, but in daily routine and shared memory. As the image fades, what remains is the simple fact that humans once chose to stay, to wake in the same place, to face the same people, to let time, rather than movement, shape their lives. That choice, made quietly and without certainty, does not demand admiration. It invites reflection on how much of human life still unfolds in small spaces, on how often stability arises not from design, but from patience. And as we return to the present moment, the village recedes into deep time, leaving behind no instruction, no demand, only a gentle reminder that closeness itself was once the experiment, and that in many ways it still is.